Okay, it's time for another edition of Know the Code Show. Today, we have a lot to get through. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the WordPress events, and we're going to start with understanding how arguments are passed. But before we can get into WordPress events, we need to understand some PHP code first. That's the big part, right? Right now, you see on your screen a graphic that I have put together here. Let me explain this to you. So WordPress event wiring, if you think of wires itself, you have to remember I'm an electronics and electrical engineer also. So I think in how the ones and zeros in the electronics, that electricity flows, and I think in wires. So when I talk about WordPress event wiring, that's what I'm talking about, is how do I wire up this function to this function to get things to work together. Okay, so just real quick, we're going to go through this much more next week. But when you have an event, we have all of the hooks that are in WordPress are events. So they fire and then something occurs. It goes out and calls all the callbacks that allows you then to extend the functionality of WordPress. Those are the events, and they are in filters and actions, right? Filters and actions. Today we're going to be looking at filters. Actions work the same way. We have an event name. So this is the firing of the event when apply_filters fires, which means executes in the code. It's then going to fire this name, this event name. It's going to pass these two args. And if we look at the wiring that occurs, that event name wires down here to where you have declared and wired up your callback. Here's your callback to this event name when you did an add filter. You then said that there are two parameters, two args, that need to be passed from this particular event, right? So we have 1, 2. They flow down here. I need 2. We come down and we see that this wires to my callback. And here are each of my 2 args that came down. And notice they do not have to be named the same. Keep that in mind. Okay. We'll talk more about that next week, but let's just move on. We're going to be talking about callback dynamic processing and how these args are passed. And I introduced you to a PHP function called user function array. So before I get into the actual challenges and questions, just real quick, I just wanted to put this graphic up here and show you the wiring that occurs, and we'll come back to this. Basically, we have a callback, that wires up to your function or method for a callback. And then there's an array of arguments that get passed, and they're put into an array and then passed in like this. All right, so we'll get back to that. Let me go ahead and get rid of this, get it off the screen. So I hope that you had fun going through these challenges this week. I know I had a lot of fun putting it together. So let's get to question number 1. I gave you some starting code, right? And here's the code. Yeah, I always give you a plugin that you can put into your sandbox project and activate it and then run it to see what occurs. So basically, we have some variables here that we want to then go and push those off dynamically to whatever is attached to and wired up to this particular event. Okay, so I'm simulating what occurs when we fire an event in WordPress, because this particular function right here is in core, and you're going to see that next week and how this works, okay? So let's say I'm doing a filter and I need to pass all of this stuff to all the callbacks that are wired up to this particular filter. whether that filter is the title, the content, whatever that particular filter is, right? Okay. So what we do is we have this PHP function, we have a callback, and we have a bunch of arguments. All right. So in the first question, what I asked you about is basically when this thing fires, what is the relationship to the plugins function, which is called, I know it's not very original, my_callback. What's the relationship? What's going to happen? Okay. So let's talk about that and see what I'll give you a good explanation on what actually happens. But basically, if we were to look in the PHP manual itself, the real quick synopsis of what happens is it fires this wired up function. That's what it does. It goes out and it looks it up and it fires it, and then it passes all the arguments to it. Now, we're going to talk about how each of these arguments get assigned as this function down here gets called and executed. Okay. So, if we look in the manual, you'll see that we have a callback, and then we have a list of parameters, arguments that are going to get passed, and they're put into an array. Yeah? Why an array? Because at the time that this gets called, we don't know how many arguments are specified within the callback function itself. So let's say that function had one argument and we're passing 5. That's not a problem. Let's say that I'm trying to pass 5, but there's only, or there's 5 that are declared and there's 1. Here, this allows me to do some dynamic processing. Okay. One note I want to put to you is this callback has to be the fully qualified path, right? So I couldn't just say with my code, because I namespace, I couldn't just say my callback. It wouldn't know where to find it. So I had to put namespace in there or call it out specifically. And then it would know, okay, I'm looking up, what do I call this? Here's my full namespace, right? Up here. And then it puts callback after it. So now it knows the full path to go and look it up. It's like a map, right? So it's going and it's saying, this is how I find you in my lookup table of all the functions that I've already compiled. Good. Now, how are the arguments passed? So I have 1, 2, 3 arguments, but I only have 1 down here in my callback. Okay. How are the arguments passed? What happens with this function is when it calls or when it fires, it goes first, as I just said, and it looks up all the callbacks. So that callback right there, it's going to look it up in its table and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to be calling this one down here. I'm going to be passing this array of indexed arguments, indexed array. Okay. And I'm going to then come down and I'm going to dynamically discover what arguments have already been declared in this function. So here is my one declaration. I want a string called value. I could have called it anything. I could have said my value. Let me just fix that real quick so you can see that the name that occurs within this function has a scope to this function only, not to what's being passed. So up here, value is scoped to this function. And when it gets passed, I'm passing the actual, not the variable, I'm passing the value, the data that's contained and assigned within that variable. So therefore, the name up here does not matter when it comes down. It doesn't have to match the names. Does that make sense? If not, put a question. We'll talk about it some more when we get to the Q&A. All right, so what PHP does is it comes down and it says, all right, I'm holding 3. I've got 3 variables, right? 3 args that I want to assign somewhere. And it pulls it down, and now they're available to the function, but we're only assigning one of those. So it says, okay, I'm going to start, and it goes in order. It's an indexed array, and it goes in order. It goes 1, 2, 3. So if I called this, for example, down here in my underscore function, if I called it episode underscore number, I'm not going to get the second spot, right? I'm not going to get that second argument. I'm going to get the first one, not the second one, because these line up in order. So value comes down, the first arg comes down to here. Second arg would come down if I had them all spaced out. They align 1 for 1 for 1. Let's come back to my little map, my little graphic. Argument 1 goes to the first spot. Argument 2 goes to the second spot, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? All right. So what happens to the other variables? They're not assigned, right? They're just sitting out there. PHP knows about them. They're held in memory. Now I need a way to pull them down into the local scope of this function so I can do something with them. And I can do that. There is a PHP function that allows me to do that. And that was this pseudocode that I put here. I said, go out and find the function in PHP that allows you to then go and pull in those functions, or sorry, not those functions, those arguments that were not assigned. And that's your code challenge number 1. Did you find the function? I actually cheated. And it's right there. I realized it after I published it and went, well, that's kind of silly. Well, there you go. There was a hint for you. Excuse me while I have some lemon water. All right, so let's get out of this. We'll come over here. The function that you want to use is func underscore get underscore args. And what it does, it's going to return an array of all, emphasized, screaming loud, all of the arguments that were passed to it, the argument list, all of them. And it's going to assign it to the variable that you're assigning it to. Okay. So I'm going to scoot over here. And I'm going to say, all right, so here it is. And I'm assigning it to, wow, look at that. I'm just calling it args. Isn't that clever? What's going to end up in args when I var dump it? And why? I said all. Would you expect value, which has been assigned in the declaration when it comes in and executes my underscore callback, would you expect that variable value to be in args? Well, let's run it and see what happens. So that one we can ignore because that came from, get my cursor out of the way. This was the first var dump we did so that we could see the value before we called the callback. And then these are all the args that got assigned to the value or the variable $args. Look at that. There's value. I said all. It assigns all of them. And notice it's an indexed array, 0, 1, 2, because indexed arrays start at 0, right? I go back to this, 0, 1, and in our case, we have another one because we have 3 args that we're passing. So and in my little graphic, that would then wire up to another spot here. All right, so if we go back and we look at the code, 1. This would be spot 0, 1, 2. Okay. But I've already assigned value. I don't want it in my args list. Okay. We'll back up here a second. Question number 2.b was true or false, is value in args? I think you know the answer to that one now, don't you? Yes, it's been assigned because func underscore get underscore args pulls in, drum roll, all of the arguments. The entire argument list that was passed to this callback, it pulls them all in. This is pretty handy too in a lot of other applications that we'll talk about later on. But if there are more variables than you've declared and you want to know what they are, for some reason you need to pass another one and you have a special case, ding, right there, that's how you would get to it. All right, so we did our var dump. Excellent. Now let's move on to the next question, or the next code challenge, which was, I asked you for another function, PHP function, how I can get rid of, I'm going to slice out, wasn't that clever that I used the word slice, an array. How can I slice up an array? I hope you found the answer to be array underscore slice, right? As I pretty much gave it away to you. So let's go and look. All right, so here it is. We're going to walk through this list of how you use array underscore slice. Okay. And then we'll talk about the code. So the first thing we want is the array. In our case, the array is $args, right? Because it's holding all of our args. The offset, this position here, is where do we want to start slicing? You know, give me a starting point. And remember that it's indexed 0. And length. How many of the arguments do I want to pull? Or how much of the elements of the array do I want to pull out? And then I'm going to be assigning that. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. And let's uncomment this. So what I'm doing is going to start at position 1. That's, I want to grab position 1. So I'm getting rid of the first position, which is index 0. I want to slice that baby out of there. And I want 2 of them. Excellent. And then I'm going to var dump that out. And then what I'm going to do, if I'm simulating how a filter works, I want to do something with it, right? So I'm then going to take the value, and so clever of me, I'm going to take that first position in the argument list, and I'm going to append it to the end of value, and then I'm going to toss it back. I'm going to return it back here and assign it to value again, and then I'm going to var dump that out. What do you think is going the value of the variable value? What do you think that it's going to hold? What data is it going to hold? What am I appending? I hope you said episode number up here, which if I look in here, episode number is 4 because, well, let me show it to you first, and then I'll explain the why. Okay, so I run this. La, la, la. Okay, and then I come down. This is my var dump after I sliced out the first one. So if I look at this, up here was before I sliced, and you can see value is still in there, and then this is the episode number, and then just to be funny, I put in an array just to show a third parameter coming in. All right, so I sliced out the value, so now this is the first position, which is index 0. The first element in my array is the episode number of 4. The second position, second element is that array variable that I passed in. So I take value and then I append the first element of my array right here. And what gets returned back is the title, value. So it will say, this is episode number, boom, 4. It appended it. So it noticed this is what it was before. This is what it is after. Go back to the code and we'll take a look. This is how your filters work. Can't stress that enough. And we're going to go through the code next week, the actual core code, and we're going to take a look at that. But this is why when you call the title and you want to change the title or the excerpt or the content, and then you do something with it and you append or you change something, this is how it's working. So what comes back to me, what gets assigned, I've returned it now to value here. And then I've dumped value out. So from this return, it comes back. So I execute this, I return it back, boom, it gets assigned. Now I have a new state to the variable value. And that's why I changed it. And this is how WordPress allows us to extend the functionality of the core, which is the whole point for the hooked events system. So if we come down and we look one more time, I just want to stress this point one more time. When I did array slice, I essentially removed that first element, which was this element right here, and I shifted this one over and that one over. And now this is position 0 and that's position 1. So when I came down here and I said args and I want to grab that first element out of that array, it wasn't value anymore. It was the episode number. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you. Let's talk about the Q&A section here now. All right. Marcy asked me about the wired callbacks. Yeah, I know. I like to use the words wiring. And I explained that when we first started the episode. So if you think about how a computer works, you sit and you write your code. Your code then gets compiled down into little ones and zeros, which ones and zeros are electricity that run through. Well, it used to run through wires. Okay, I'm old. Now it runs through nice little soldered points on boards and even faster than that now. So, but it used to run a lot on wires. So I talk in wiring. And when you hear, some people still use that vernacular, mostly if they're older like me and been around the block a few days. All right, decades. That's how that works. Okay, can you wrap a var dump with pre? Yeah, absolutely. And I do that a lot too, depending upon what my sandbox environment is. Otherwise, you can get some nasty looking junk coming out, depending upon how you've styled things. But yeah, sometimes if I'm working on a live hosting environment, I'll need to wrap it in pre so it looks pretty. And I like var dump. Actually, what I like using is something different than that. I'm doing it here in this particular show, but I use something else. Let me see if I can find it real quick, and then I'll show you. I'll answer another question while I'm doing that. Okay, here it is. Sorry, I just found it. I'm going to slide it over here into the view. This is what I like using. And I use Composer to pull it in as one of my development dependencies. And then I use this. And all I have to do is put a D and wrap it in. So instead of var dump, it's doing a var dump, but it gives me a lot more information and it compresses it up, rolls it up into a nice little box that I can then click on and open it up. And I can see a lot of cool stuff that lets me debug even better. So I know Patrick's sitting there right now going, ooh, what's that cool tool? I want to use it. It's pretty cool. Use it. Okay. And then Patrick asks, sounds like funcget_args can be used to test variables you want to target when using things. Yeah, it can. There's a lot of things you can do with that. There's other parameters that you can use too. And if I go back just real quick, you can also discover how many arguments there are by using this particular function, which basically is just a little counter. So you can pull them all in and then count yourself if you wanted to, or you can use this like little thing. So then you would know, hey, there's some extras that have been thrown to my function, and so I better go grab them. And that's what you would do with that. So I hope that answers your question, Patrick. All right, looks like that's all the questions that have been asked today. Now, next week, we're going to do some cool stuff too, because we're going to dig into core. Now that you understand array slice and getting the extra arguments, yeah, and using PHP's callback mechanism with the call_user_func_array function, now we can dig into core. I hope that you're going to join me next week, because boy, it's going to be a good one. All right. Thank you so much. Hey, if you guys got any more questions, leave them in the comments or head over to our Slack channel and put them there, and we can talk there too. Thanks.